All right. I'm super pumped about this. So I haven't talked to Sam in a long time. Cal's video is off. So I'm here with Sam and Cal, and we didn't know what we're going to talk about, but we just kind of decided I decided that we want to talk about the Trinity, because I think this will be interesting, because I've had a lot of Trinitarian conversations with both Sam and Cal separately, and I think they have really interesting perspectives and backgrounds and angles on the discussion, and they've never spoken before, so this is a Trinity. Talking about the Trinity. This will be really great. And so before I just stopped Cal from explaining all his Langan UBT stuff, because he's an expert. He's a Christopher Langan expert. I'm just kidding.
So this is minutes after I tried to issue a disclaimer that I'm not, any kind of Langan scholar, because there are no Langan scholars yet. If you search them on the internet, what you find is incredibly dismissive takes on him from people who largely don't seem to even understand what he's talking about. I think he's fascinating. I think he's onto something.
We'll put him in the camp of Rupert Sheldrake then. Same
or
thing.
Jordan Peterson or Ayn Rand, or
Don't put Ayn Rand in there.
All right,
Yeah.
We won't put Ayn Rand in the category.
Ayn Rand.
All right, so why don't you lay out Langan, CTMU, UBT a little bit, and maybe I'll even send Jeff descriptions as to what those acronyms mean and put them in the description or whatever, and then we can jump into like how that relates to Trinitarian, because you told me this morning in a box. You said you like the CTMU and you came at that to help you understanding your faith and coming into Christianity, and you think the CTMU explains Christianity, not the other way around.
Oh, right. Yeah, because there's in traditional theology, not just for Christianity, but for pretty much all religions, there's this ubiquitous idea of divine simplicity. And how I really see that is like, this is coming from a kind of objects frame, or like almost like a materialist sort of perspective or framework, where there's objects made of parts, like people and things, and then there's God, who's an object not made of parts. It's really, if you have something that has like no properties except just itself, it's just one property, it resists analysis, and it's the outcome of every sort of it's the logical terminus of every apophatic or hyper negative theology. It ends up just saying, look, God is just radically unlike anything else. He's totally unique. He can't be compared with anything. You can't even refer to him, because whatever you're referring to is not God. Si comprehendis non est Deus. You understand that it's not God. And then it's like, also God is a person, and he's a mind. And you can say, well, he's not a person, he's not a mind, but he's person-like, and he's mind-like, and he's father-like. But he's also beyond all dualities. But that doesn't work. So it's like, either he's father-like or he's not father-like. Or if you say he's utterly, absolutely, transcendently simple, he's beyond that duality. And so it just, to me, it's crazy. Like, I believe that materialism is unworkable. Is my camera on, by the way? Because I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I believe that materialism is unworkable. But if the solution, your theistic solution to the problems of materialism, is itself like riddled with logical problems, then that's like not good. There needs to be. God is infinite. That's the thing. But there need, in order to account for make sense of how God can be infinite, but also like personal and mind-like and a consciousness, you need something sophisticated. And I think that's what the CTMU does. In Langan's words, it offers an account of the interplay between the eternal interplay between freedom and constraint. Well, that was a paraphrase, but
And so that's kind of so I mean, correct me, I mean, you are not a Langan scholar, and I know of Langan only through you. So this is like Langan telephone.
Yeah.
I once read the first paragraph or two on his Wikipedia page.
There you go. So, but if I was going to compare it or relate it, it's kind of the idea, and even what you were riffing on. So in Trinitarian theology, especially, well, monarchical Trinitarian theology, God the Father is ineffable, can only be talked about apophatically, beyond all dualisms, beyond being, non-being. I don't even personally like ground of being. He's just like source and emanation, but in such a way that is beyond articulation. And then the manifestation of that is always logos, and whatever, you know. So like what that though, how that relates to UBT is, with freedom and constraint, is that infinity is like unlimited potentiality and freedom, right? Because I mean, is that correct, right? Like, so that
yeah. So let me try to offer a definition of UBT here real quick, because it's a strange aspect of Langan's logic, and a lot of people say that it's illogical. But I don't think so. UBT stands for Unbound Telesis, and another one of the phrases that he uses to describe it is informational nil constraint. So it's the complete absence of specification or description, or constraint. Now you might say that itself is a constraint or description, and that's true. So the way I would suggest you see it, in order to, you know, see the thing is, some people have this idea that you can't even reference contradiction, which is stupid. Like, you know, the way it is if I have a statement that contains a contradiction, like, my car is red and green all over, I cannot conceive what that represents, but nonetheless, that contradiction can be framed and referred to. I can refer to the idea of contradiction. And that's essentially what nothingness or nil constraint is. It's both X and not X / neither X nor not X. The thing that you get from apophatic theology, just God isn't this and he's not that and he's not that and he's not anything you can name, is nothingness. But rightly understood, nothingness is in some sense, it's like equivalent to everythingness. Yep. It's total like nil constraint. You know, both X and not X is logically equivalent to neither X nor not X. It's not light, nor is it the absence of light, which means that it's both light and the absence of light. What was I going to say? Yeah, so the thing is, not only can you reference the idea of contradiction, you have to, because otherwise even logic doesn't have a definition. What is logic? Logic is the art of reasoning without falling into what?
Right. The law of contradiction needs the idea of contradiction to even be stated.
Yep. Very, very good. And that's really at the heart, or one of the things that's at the heart of the CTMU, this idea that, you know, there is an interplay or a dynamic between freedom and constraint, between the one-valued logic of UBT and the two-valued logic of consciousness.
What do you think about all that, Sammy?
Yeah, so here are some of my thoughts. The weird thing about Unitarianism is, if you're going to be like, first off, it makes divine simplicity way easier, right? Like, I've had conversations with Tripp about Tripp Parker about the incoherencies of Trinitarianism and divine simplicity together, right? And Thomas Aquinas was way into divine simplicity and way into Trinitarianism. I don't think it works in the final analysis. And it's not just Unitarians that say that. There's a lot of scholars that most of the time they'll throw out divine simplicity before they throw out Trinitarianism. But they're like, if you're saying God is three things in one thing, you're just not simple anymore. Like, yeah, it's more deep than that. But at the end of the day, so I think you could do it better the way the older church fathers did it, by making basically God the Father the apophatic thing, or the super transcendent, the hyper transcendent sort of Platonic like God, divine simplicity thing. And then you make sort of the logos like the first, or wait 1 second, sorry. Am I back? I was going,
You're back.
sorry. All right. Like you make God the Father sort of almost beyond everything, right? Like
Mhm.
what you were talking about. And then the logos or the Son or whatever becomes sort of like the first emanation or caused thing. And like the Son is the source of personhood, right? But the Father almost isn't even personal at that point, right? Beyond personhood. And then how they fit in the Holy Spirit is always a subject for debate. But
Well, the Holy Spirit would be that dynamic, the interplay between freedom and constraint, the dynamic whereby the logos or consciousness is refined over time, and that dynamic is love. In other words, it's teleology. That's why it's doing what it's doing.
And
But what you just
that's
said,
always initiated from the nothingness. Let's be clear on that.
it's
And
initiated from the nothingness.
yeah, and initiated from the nothingness and then reflected back with the logos. I mean, we got to get the
There is some hard to define sense in which what is possible does have logical priority over the actual. But like the consciousness and the two-valued logic, that's actual. And like absolute possibility, it's distinct from that, but in some ways it's like it does have logical priority over that.
Yeah. So this, yeah. What was I going to say? This is all. Go, Sam.
So that was like old school Trinitarianism, even before it was ever really called that, right? And then Augustine kind of comes along and sort of messes things up. And then, it wasn't just the West, like the East seems to have gotten a little messed up in the same way. But basically the divine essence becomes the unspeakable thing. And then you've got like these three persons that are all consciousness. And it's like, well, personhood doesn't, it's like, I don't know. It just never seems to work quite as well once you put all three of the persons on the same level and then the essence above them.
Well,
But if you have,
there's some sense though in Trinitarian theology where, because like even before you said, and maybe this was a Freudian slip or maybe it was intentional. I don't know with your language, but you said the logos is the cause thing, and I mean and that wouldn't square with Trinitarian theology because they would say uncaused, co-eternal.
Well, so the West kind of downgrades cause to be like, even Thomas Aquinas will say the Father is the principle of the Son. And I don't quite know enough Thomistic vocabulary to understand the difference between, he specifically says that the Son is not caused, right? And I think part of that is like Thomas Aquinas really liked his proofs for God, right? And one of them was like, hey, everything has a cause,
right,
but there can't be an infinite chain of causes because that would be silly. And so then there's one thing that is the uncaused cause of everything else, and that's obviously God. But if he were to say that the Son was caused, then he would only have a logical proof for a Unitarian God the Father, right? And he doesn't want the Son kicked out of the Godhead that he's proving.
Well, isn't this
so?
What is it? I may be misquoting this, with Saint John of the Cross or whatever, which is like the per se, per accident causation. So God the Father is a per se cause in that he's fundamental and in principle. It's probably similar to what Thomas Aquinas was getting at. He's like logically former, like fundamental, not even prior, because it's not when you add temporality in there, it gets confusing. And so it's like the idea, the way Nathan Jacobs illustrated it this way when he was talking about, like, if you imagine an always existent table with books on it, well, they're there forever, but the table is fundamentally causal and underneath and supporting the books, but it's not causing it in a temporal way. Like that's probably the whole idea of just like eternally begetting.
But I think even Thomas Aquinas wants to avoid that sort of begetting for the Son in relation to the Father, because then it would be kind of outside of his proofs and whatever. But anyway, so the problem that a Christian has is, well, like, God in the Old Testament, like, says things, he does things, he seems to feel things, right? All of that sort of stuff. He has attributes that he is, and he has attributes that he isn't, right? There's the sense in which it's hard to square divine simplicity with the God of the Old Testament. And so what would often happen is that in early Christian theology, the God of the Old Testament was basically the Son,
Yeah.
right? And that
For sure, yeah.
Say that, Luke?
All theophanies, for sure.
Right, all theophanies, and the person who's talking most of the time is the Son and stuff like that. And you only get occasional glimpses of God the Father in the Old Testament. And really what Jesus becomes incarnate to do in that theology is to tell you about God the Father. It's like, all right, you knew me this whole time, guys. But let me tell you, there's this other God that's even more beyond, and et cetera, et cetera. And the Old Testament was almost like the training ground for even getting humanity ready to accept the idea of the one highest God, or something like that. That was sort of the idea. You see that in Justin Martyr and Irenaeus. And that's way different than like what most modern American Trinitarian evangelicals think. Most of them think the God of the Old Testament was God the Father. And then like the new thing about the New Testament was Jesus, right? And
Well,
old school
because well, that's like, that makes me think of, I mean, a lot of Orthodox scholars and John Bayer would be adamant about that, is that the whole point of everything, and my priest here says that very often, is what makes, like, he just said this in the last sermon, the first sermon that I've heard since COVID. He gave this last, like, 2 Sundays ago. And it was basically the idea, well, I won't go into all that, but he made the point of, it's all of Christian theology is about Jesus. Like, it's not about some kind of abstracted, untouchable God, because the whole point is you wouldn't know that God except through Jesus. So anytime you ever know anything about God, it's always about Jesus, and it's in a very non-Gnostic, tangible, practical, palpable, touchable, bodied way, which is what iconography and what all of that is about, is that you see God through the full image, the icon of Jesus Christ. And that's the only way you ever do, and only way you ever have. You cannot know God except through Jesus Christ. Anyone.
And so the slight Unitarian problem to that is, how do we, because a Unitarian could either be very classically theist, but then you basically end up deist, right? And that's the way that a lot of Unitarianism actually went, right? Is that there's the one God who's so far beyond, and it's almost like he doesn't care anymore, right? And that sort of led to sort of materialism and a lot of things like that, was basically Unitarian classical theism, right? And then there's almost no bridge anymore, right? There's this giant gulf, and then eventually God just sort of becomes irrelevant. And it's like, what's the difference between deism and atheism, other than like deism has an explanation for how things got started, or something like that.
Just in my own efforts to understand these questions and these problems, and understand the infinity of God and how is it that the finite participates with the infinite and all this, I just arrived at sort of the view that I explained earlier, where you've got informational nil constraint or nothingness on the one hand, which is also everythingness. It's infinity. It's just what's undefined. And then on the other hand, you have a conscious mind in whom we live and move and have our being as an act. Now, this mind, it's not infinite. It is defined. Is it externally defined by something outside it? No, it's self-defined. But this mind you could call the Logos Asarkos. You could call it the second person of the Trinity, but pre-incarnate or pre-embodied, if you like. But it is finite. just self-defined. There's nothing really outside it that's bigger, but it can self-configure and assume a new configuration, and indeed it must, because consciousness is by its nature always transforming. If you have a static, flat consciousness, you have an unrepresentable consciousness, and it's like just no such thing. It's not consciousness. It's nothingness. Nothingness does not exist in consciousness because it's undefined, but it can be approached as a limit of syntactic transformations, as Langan puts it. And so basically, but the, you know, how and why does this self-defined mind transform over time? The answer is love. There's a dynamic between it and the infinite. And you know, that you could call it third person of the Trinity, and it offers a sense in which God is love. But yeah, for me, that's a pretty clean view. I don't, you know, I just don't really feel any problems with it. I didn't do much theological reading when I became Christian. I kind of came at things from a very fresh angle without much history or baggage.
Mm-hmm.
So not to, like, I'm definitely, I just, sometimes I smile. I don't know if we're recording this in the 3-person thing, but when Cal just says just like those logic bomb dense sentences, I just have to smile at them. Because just the way you talk, it's just, I love it. It's fantastic. It's just not
I've got a whole podcast where it's just me dropping what I consider to be logic bombs.
Oh, that's great stuff. But then, so what do you think about the idea? Because what you just said, you were saying by definition, the logos would not be infinite, like definitionally, because it's some consciousness. It has to entail some kind of constraint. But then
it's a self-restriction off of the infinite.
Yeah. So Peugeot has said before, and I like this, but I feel like it's one of these sentences that you could talk about forever because it's almost endlessly dense. But he said the most important thing about Christianity is that the expression of the infinite is also infinite.
Right. And so again, just to flag this, these are not really my own ideas. They're a simplification of Langan's ideas. So in some sense, the blame belongs to me, the credit belongs to him. But
Oh, you could do that the other way around. That would be much
much more favorable to me. But
yeah.
no. So I mean, before I read Langan, I was really, at least intellectually, an atheist. I was sort of existentially a Christian, but I couldn't make it square. I didn't have an understanding of, you know, how does God even make sense? Yeah, he's simple, but he's also Trinitarian. It's like, what? It's like, get out of here. Nobody knows what they're talking about. But so see, here's the thing. So like you have this is the question of time. Is God outside of time? Well, he's outside of, if by time you mean 4D space-time, yes, he's outside of that. He can see all of 4D space-time as though it were static. But does that mean that God is not subject to time at all? Well, in another sense, yes. In other words, time is not something external to God that's absolute and independent of him. And he's just, oh, I'm just subject to time like anyone else. You know, I'm just trying to move on in time. So, but the thing is, I think the CTMU answer there, the Langan type answer would be that there is almost like a highest order meta time that God himself parametrizes and generates. In other words, every consciousness has some kind of temporal or meta-temporal organizing grammar because it changes. So there's an order or sequentiality of some kind to the changes.
So that's like, I've heard Christian apologists. You guys hear me all right? My mic sounds dumb. Can you hear me?
I hear you.
I can hear you.
Maybe it's just my own speaker inside my ear. But I've heard a Christian apologist talk about that, of like the if there's any sort of meaningful interactions, whatever that looks like, within the persons of the Trinity, any sort of interpersonal relationship, there has to be some kind of occurrence and sequence to that occurrence, or else like there's no way to even conceive of it, even if it's like, this is maybe the meta time.
There's just no such thing as an unchanging consciousness. That's just an oxymoron. And so if it changes, there's going to be a kind of grammar along which it changes. And so it's going to have, but it's not, that's not, I'm not saying it's 4D space-time. It's like n-dimensional space-time. It's whatever the highest level of is in that manifold or whatever.
Yeah.
So the question is, oh yeah, so the expression of infinite is also infinite. So I would say that at a given, if you will, instant of meta time, it's finite, but it's infinite over meta time. So so there is, I think you just need some kind of time-like idea. Like Langan says that ultimate reality is a closed time-like meta process. You need some kind of time-like idea in order, I think, to account for the dynamic or interplay between the finite and the infinite.
Mm-hmm. And so part of the reason why Christian theology moved away from that sort of, you might say, meta divine, God the Father, divine Son, or arenic God the Father and agent God the Son, sort of to use the language that Vanderklay uses a lot, is that it seemed to, that there's a clear hierarchy there, right? There's this clear God the Father on top, and then God the Son next. And there are a lot of things that God the Father is or isn't, kind of both, that the Son is, right? And it gets really hard to say that they're the same essence or something like that. And that was really what the Arian controversy was about, is the Arians were like, yeah, God the Father in some sense is hierarchically higher and in some sense different, really, in some essential, like essence was really the word that they used, from the Son. Oh, what? No, I'm not on my professional Zoom account. Shoot.
Sam, are you, what are you, I mean, you talk to me like a college professor. Like, I almost feel like you are a professor, but you're dressed like a banker or something. Well, I don't need to talk to you. I'm curious
Sam's
what.
very smart and passionate and cares a lot and reads a lot because he's a Unitarian who's gone to evangelical churches, so he always had to get up his loins.
As long as
I'm a
he's not a Unitarian
statistician.
Universalist.
Huh?
No, right. So that's, I have to disagree with you guys on one or the other of those things. Yeah, I'm a statistician. I have a day job. I have a master's degree, but not a PhD, nor am I a,
Sam? Where's it from?
I don't know, it's some college in Boston that is where I got my master's degree.
Oh man, see, I knew this dude was high level. I knew this guy's a high level dude.
He's smart.
So don't flatter me too much. But so for me, and this is something that I've also heard Paul say, and like Jacob the Jew on the Discord will say things like this. The mouthy Jew on the Discord will say, like, the unique thing about the Jewish conception of God is that he's like meta divine and divine at the same time, right? That it's like he's one and he's those things, but he's both of them singularly.
Yeah,
Right.
and so this is the point at which Unitarianism starts to fall apart logically. Like, especially like you get it, like the Baal Shem Tov, the Kabbalist, he had a cool idea of God, which is like, to me it resonates a lot with my own, which is pantheistic. It was like, what is of the same essence as God? To me, everything that exists, it partakes of that essence. It must. The Unitarianism, say, of Moses Maimonides was like, like God is just radically one, radically unlike everything else. And the Muslims they believe just like this too, the Tawhid. And you can't compare anything to him. You can't even refer to him. What I'm talking about right now isn't what I'm talking about. And that's like a clear tell that you're talking about contradiction, but not even like referring to it as contradiction as such on the second order level, but naively on the first order level, trying to name the Tao that cannot be named.
You can't make sense of multiplicity. It's
yeah, you can.
It's like monism. It doesn't work.
Yeah. So the thing is,
it's got the one in the many problem.
Yeah.
And so I think Judaism, if it's going to be like radically Unitarian, then it has tremendous logical problems. Even though initially one would be tempted to think that that's the metaphysically cleaner, if you will, simpler view. Yeah, so I mean, the thing is, there's got to be, you know, like, and it's interesting because the Baal Shem Tov, he's just much more mystical in the way that he approaches, you know, the question of how is it that there's unity and multiplicity. Because I think he believed that on some level, like, only God exists, which is a cool idea. But Maimonides, you know, he had to retreat into mystery, which is what you have to do, because you have to just say, look, God is just can't even refer to him really.
All right, so I've got an out. I've got one out, and my out is angels.
Angels.
So one thing that I've been thinking about is sort of what, you know, like my favorite book in the New Testament is the book of Hebrews. And the book of Hebrews talks a lot about angels. I think of all the books in the New Testament, it spends more time talking about angels. Maybe Revelation does. And it has this sort of, I don't know, this regime change theology or something like that. That
Right.
like before Jesus, we had a mediated interaction with God through angels, right? No one saw God directly. No one's ever heard from him. No one's seen his face. If we were to see his face, we wouldn't live, right? So there was this angelic mediation. And that's sort of, angels are multiplicitous, and they can somehow mediate between the human realm and the divine realm. But then what happens is with Jesus is there's a regime change where it talks about Jesus starts lower than the angels, like he's a human like us, but then he like penetrates into the divine realm and he becomes the superior mediator, which allows humans more direct interaction with God. But now we, instead of interacting with God through angels, which is presumably foggier and inferior to the direct mediation that we now have through Jesus. So it keeps this idea of mediation and non-direct interaction with God, and sort of like gives the ontology of personhood to the angelic realm. And then it like switches so that humans are now above the angels, and it's sort of like part of this human glorification or this human divinization process, where we can now handle the more direct interaction with God that the angels previously did for us.
So what I was gonna say, yeah, that's all great, and I would agree with that. And I think that's what Jesus was the God or God putting on flesh, putting on humanity, adding on humanity to.
Blah.
Huh? No,
I was just making a blah noise.
but not,
Let me jump in here, because
I'm not meaning God the Father. You
Yeah,
know,
I know.
I'm a Trinitarian, and so because I would say the same. You have the same problem with angels. Angels aren't unmediated. They don't have self-existence. They're not something. So they're mediated to God through the source, to the ineffable source, through the logos too. They have to be. They're not autonomous, self-existent things. And so you need logos no matter what, for humanity or angels or anyone. What were you going to say, Cal?
Oh, I thought that Sam was making dismissive noises at the idea of the incarnation. Do you believe in the incarnation, or are you something different?
With qualification.
Something different. Yeah, I mean, I would say I would be fine with the idea of incarnation if it's like an abstract principle being finally embodied. But what bugs me is like that there is this like super person, right, that then becomes like metamorphs or empties himself, or the idea that there was some super person that voluntarily turned into a human person. Whereas I would say it was something like God's promises or God's wisdom or whatever put into human practice for the first time.
So yeah, like I don't have a radically kenotic understanding of the incarnation, but you know, like the first analogy I would go to is like a video game. You're playing a video game, you have a character in the game. Are you that character?
Mm-hmm.
You are and you aren't. But the sense in which you are is the sense in which it's like a direct expression of your positive will translated into another medium. Now, that would make sense of a docetist view of the incarnation, Jesus, the divine hologram, but he suffers and feels nothing. That's not satisfactory for various reasons. So another way you could approach this is you could say, in Jesus, there are two minds. Like, wait, stop, sound the alarm bells. Nestorianism, this is a heresy. There's nothing new under the sun. Hold on. The two minds are informationally integrated. What analogy do we have for that? Well, we have our own brains for that. Roger Sperry's split brain experiments showed us that when you informationally disintegrate or separate the two hemispheres, they function as two different persons, and the left hand knows not what the right hand doeth, or hemisphere. But you integrate them in the experiences as of one person, not necessarily free of emotional conflict, as neither was Jesus. He wasn't free of internal conflict. But it's experienced as one person, even though conceptually you can divide it into two. And you know, that's so much of what's wrong with thinking about divine simplicity, as thinking about God as an object without parts. Because you say there is just no division in God, with like not even under analysis. Like, no, it's like, but that's false. You know, I don't believe you can disassemble God part by part like a material object. But I do believe that he divides under analysis into aspects. Same thing with the mind of Jesus. It could be said to be a composite mind. It has a human nature or mind, by which I mean there's an intellect and a heart. There's a representational capacity and an affective or motivational capacity, which is really almost like the same thing, because your emotions are representations of the world that are valence. And I think in the intellect too, these higher level abstract representations are also always valence phenomenologically, but that's kind of a separate issue. So to me, there's no a priori problem with the incarnation. I can make sense of it with two analogies. The first analogy being a video game, the second, Roger Sperry's